Welcome everybody, our Wednesday Global Talk. Let me start with our territorial acknowledgements. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. As you know, we have some housekeeping issues just to recall at the beginning of every talk. We'll ask you to please keep your microphone and your video off during the talk, but there are ways of engaging during the Zoom webinar using the chat function to share thoughts, questions, etc., and we'll monitor that. But when after Juliana has finished her talk, we'll have some time for a Q&A, and at that point, please feel free to put your hand up or use the hand function in Zoom to get our attention, and then we'll turn to you. And we wonder if perhaps we could ask people, if they feel comfortable, to, at the end of Juliana's talk, during the Q&A, to turn your video on. Please keep your microphone off until you want to ask a question or make a comment. But otherwise, see if we can create some kind of sense of community by having at least your video on during the Q&A. But keep that video and microphone off during the talk. Okay, hope that's clear. Thank you. It is a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce Juliana today because Juliana graduated with an honors history degree in 2020, together with a major in political science. I know all that because Juliana was a student of mine many years ago in a survey class, and she really did stand out in that class, I recall. Juliana, as a master's student, that's something to actually kind of remark upon because many of our graduate students are PhD students, so it's notable that Juliana comes in the second year of her MA program. She graduated with a background in global history, political theory, public memory, and her research interests here at the Center for Global Studies, well, they align so perfectly: human mobilities, borders, boundaries, refugee resettlement, citizenship. Juliana currently works and resides as a guest on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen peoples, but Juliana was raised on the Mowatchit and Muchalit First Nation lands. So Juliana, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for being with us this year. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Martin. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen.
I'm just gonna unshare first.
Okay. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Looks great.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'd also like to thank the CFGS again for inviting me into the hallways of the center and for offering this opportunity for me to share my research and progress and receive feedback from colleagues. I also need to thank the center for kickstarting my interest in borders and boundaries, and to borders and globalization in particular. In the summer of 2019, I had the opportunity to write and present a paper at a workshop on Canadian border policies, which was hosted by BIG and partnered with the CBSA. At the time, I was interested in comparing European third country agreements with safe third country agreement between the US and Canada. My current thesis work in many ways builds on this paper, wherein I argued that border enforcement practices intended to limit irregular mobilities and border crossings have had the twin effect of restricting access to asylum procedures. By criminalizing and policing irregular mobilities, states, so I had argued, sidestepped their obligations to asylum seekers under the 1951 Convention and its 1967 Protocol. Although I still stand behind the spirit of what this workshop paper was trying to do, I've come to be critical of how my paper conceptualized and theorized the relationships between borders, territories, jurisdictions, and the various categorizations of human movement. In my previous analysis, I was so focused on understanding the particular instances where border enforcement was dislocated from the territorial boundaries of states that I missed seeing the bigger picture. What was missing, and what I hope to examine further, was understanding significant shifts in how the international state system is spatially and temporally constituted through dynamic and conflicting bordering practices, and how the international system is experienced by people seeking asylum. Another critique of how I had conceptualized borders emerged while I was working on my undergraduate honors thesis, where I was concerned with how concepts of the West and its other played out in the territories that would become the Greco-Turkish borderlands. My thesis aimed to demonstrate the relevance of Edward Said's 1978 literary critique, Orientalism, for understanding the physical and violent dynamics of state building in an area of the world increasingly imagined by European publics and policymakers as a fault line between an imagined Western Christian liberal self and an imagined Eastern Islamic authoritarian other. Linking Orientalism and colonialism with border making changed my perspective and starting point for analyzing borders. Bringing in questions of power and authority allowed me to better understand borders as they establish and maintain relationships between spaces, jurisdictions, and people, which borders themselves create through partition. It is my hope to remain attentive to the dynamics of colonialism and power in my master's work on borders. I'm still in the early stages of my MA thesis, so I'm hoping that today I can offer an overview of my primary research questions. I'll also be speaking about some of the methodological and conceptual debates my thesis engages with in addressing these questions. I welcome and look forward to your feedback, questions, and comments at the end of the presentation, and I'm excited to hear what you think about my approach to understanding contemporary borders and what's at stake. For a bit of context, I started my undergraduate program in the months just before the election of Donald Trump and just after the start of what would be called a crisis of migration governance in the European Union. It was in this climate that I picked up an interest in understanding why and how political leaders, through a language of crisis, cast international migration as a problem. Of course, given that not all international border crossers were presented as problems, I looked to understand the social, cultural, political, and economic dynamics through which some bodies and mobilities came to be met with suspicion and violence. Staged as a matter of national security and as an expression of declining state sovereignty, border enforcement practices and strategies to regulate human mobilities were and are especially salient in political, contemporary debates and campaigns. Walls, fences, deportations, and detentions have become key flashpoints in academic and popular condemnations of the inhumane and violent means through which states exercise borders and manage human mobilities. Although there remains much to be said about the very real human impacts of what Wendy Brown described as the theatrics of national security, stability, and sovereignty, manifest in the global proliferation of wall-building projects, the intent of my research is to examine the quiet, administrative, and technical strategies of border and migration governance that may only capture fleeting, broad public attention. One such administrative strategy under the purview of my research is the STCA between the US and Canada. It is one instance of the phenomena I hope to explore in my thesis. The Safe Third Country Agreement carries an intention to strengthen international cooperative responses to processing asylum claims by clarifying the procedural obligations of partied states. In the context of the EU, the Dublin Regulation, which clarifies asylum procedures among EU member states, was drafted with a similar intent. Cooperation and responsibility sharing are certainly worthwhile endeavors, but each of these international agreements have been met with heavy criticism. Human rights advocates and scholars often point to the penalizing and harmful consequences of these administrative measures for asylum seekers and refugees. Briefly summarized, the STCA assumes that the US and Canada offer reasonably comparable asylum procedures and are therefore equally suitable and safe places for asylum seekers to launch their asylum claims. This means that, on the ground, people who cross from the US into Canada are ineligible to claim asylum at an official border crossing point, with very limited exceptions. Likewise, a person cannot claim asylum in the United States if arriving from Canada through an official border crossing point. However, the SDCA does not apply to people who irregularly cross the border at an unofficial crossing point. Critics and analysts of the SDCA argue that the agreement encourages, if not forces, asylum seekers to take extreme risks and undertake dangerous crossings through rural settings in order to access protection. It's not hard to locate news stories of asylum seekers who have lost their lives and limbs trying to access protection in Canada. The SDCA has been brought twice before the Federal Court of Canada on the grounds that the United States is not in actuality a safe country, and that the agreement violates Section 7 and 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's argued that Section 7 on the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person are violated due to the risk of refoulement and unjust detention for persons returned from Canada to the US. Then, with respect to Section 15 on the right to equal benefit of the law without discrimination, it's argued that asylum procedures in the US fail to account for sexualized and gender-based violence and persecution, which disproportionately harms women, gender diverse, and LGBTQ+ asylum seekers who are sent back to the US. In 2008, the Federal Court of Canada determined that the United States was not a safe third country. However, this was overruled by the Federal Court of Appeal a few months afterwards. In 2020, the case was brought again to the federal court, where the court ruled that, and to quote, "The risk of detention and loss of security of the person, which are facilitated by the SDCA, are grossly disproportional to the administrative benefits of the SDCA." The federal court's decision to issue a stay on the SDCA was overturned again by the Court of Appeal. Last December, it was announced that the case against the SDCA would be heard by the Supreme Court of Canada, but today this agreement remains in place. While it has been possible to challenge the SDCA in terms of asylum standards in the US and the rights and securities of a person protected under the Canadian Charter, my project considers the difficulties policy analysts and human rights advocates face in assessing third country agreements and other border enforcement procedures in terms of compliance with the international legal basis of today's refugee regime. Both the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol form this legal basis. I think the case of the SDCA points to some much broader issues in contemporary border and migration governance. And indeed, it's just one of many international agreements that manipulates how, when, and where asylum systems may be accessed. Bringing this larger context into view, my research engages with the theoretical underpinnings and of the critiques leveled against contemporary border administration and enforcement. In a century where we increasingly see deterritorialized and re-territorialized forms of border enforcement and administration, my thesis seeks to understand how international agreements and border technologies interact with the right and practice of seeking asylum. As you can see on my slide, I've chosen to explore this issue by responding to two related questions. First, I've asked, how does the changing nature, location, and role of state borders interact with the accessibility of territorially bound legal procedures for claiming asylum? And second, I've asked, how does the changing territoriality of borders complicate and challenge the terms of compliance and non-compliance with the 1951 Convention? The first question asks for a theoretical engagement with the extent to which externalization of migration controls have delocalized practices and experiences of borders from the territorial boundaries of states and their legal jurisdictions. Deterritorializing and re-territorializing bordering practices, restructuring how and where states exercise control, pose significant challenges to the ability of a person to seek asylum. The 1951 Convention defines the conditions under which a person gains legal status as a refugee as someone who must be, quote, outside the country of one's nationality or former habitual residence for reasons that one, unable or owing to such a fear, is unwilling to return to it. While the Convention definition works to legally differentiate between refugees, displaced persons, internally displaced persons, and other humanitarian categories of migrants in a clear but potentially problematic manner, the legal status of an asylum seeker, a person whose claim to international protection has not yet been determined and recognized, is less readily apparent. While en route to a particular destination, asylum seekers may pass through territories and cross borders without authorization to do so, encountering restrictions and obstacles set up by states to manage irregularized border crossings. States are obligated under the Convention to establish and protect procedures wherein refugees showing good cause for their illegal entry or presence, to quote Article 31, are given exception to regularized border crossing practices. However, these procedures to regularize an asylum seeker's irregular and unauthorized mobility, entry, and presence are dependent on the person's ability to access particular judicial spaces where claims to international protection may be heard and upheld. Access to these territorially bounded legal jurisdictions is complicated by the existence of externally enforced migration controls, which restrict and in many cases penalize human mobilities and effectively bar entry to spaces where it's possible to launch a refugee or asylum claim and gain convention rights and protections. In light of these challenges, the second part of the research problem asks for a grounded engagement with the terms of compliance with the 1951 Convention. Over the course of 70 years since the Convention was drafted, new governance strategies and technologies have dramatically transformed how and where states exercise power in ways that no longer correspond to the territorial assumptions underpinning the Convention. The suggestion that the Convention needs to be amended so to address new spatial and geopolitical realities isn't new. The 1967 Protocol, which expanded the conditions under which a person may claim refugee status beyond the temporal and spatial limits of the Second World War in Europe, illustrates an important instance where gaps in protection were addressed through amending the geographical basis, enabling and constraining the international refugee regime. After identifying contemporary gaps in protection, my project situates these challenges in the context of tensions and contradictions between the spatial assumptions of the Convention and an increasingly deterritorialized current reality of border enforcement practices. So the general objectives of this project can be briefly summarized as first, a theoretical engagement with the disaggregation of borders, and second, a legal and grounded analysis of the spatial assumptions and realities upon which the international refugee rests. Through this two-pronged approach, my central aim is to develop an understanding of how the disaggregation of borders interacts with the mobilities of asylum seekers and their ability to access protection. As externalization of bordering practices becomes an increasingly normalized avenue for managing and sustaining the categories of regular and irregular border crossers, scholars and policymakers will need to confront how the changing nature of border complicates and renders ambiguous the positionally dependent legal statuses and entitlements of asylum seekers under the current regime. Broadly speaking, this research is motivated to clarify and problematize some of the key concepts and assumptions that enable and limit the work undertaken by researchers, policymakers, and activists to address the global erosion of the right of asylum. In a more theoretical and descriptive fashion, my project identifies the central need throughout the research to interrogate the discourse and practice of the border, to consider how its conceptual disaggregation yields sharper insights into how states increasingly defy conceptual capture as a bounded power container, and instead exercise control over transnational, deterritorialized flows, networks, and mobilities. Then, in a more prescriptive and normative way, the project carries the tentative argument that, and as a consequence of interpreting the border as a thick multiplicity of discourses and practices, the terms of compliance with the contemporary refugee regime may need to be amended in light of the disaggregation of borders and the growing capacities of states to evade and confound their humanitarian and procedural obligations under international law. At the heart of my research project is the need to model and compare the historical, contemporary, and legal contexts enabling and disenabling access to state protection and mobility. This modeling centers and formulates an understanding of the border as it categorizes, constructs, and maintains practices relating to territory and mobility. For the next few minutes, I hope to unpack and discuss the implications of adopting an expansive definition of borders, where borders and boundaries are assumed to be multiple, overlapping, contradictory, and otherwise disaggregated practices of differentiation and relation management. I also want to point to the conceptual triad that you see represented on the slide. Rather than discussing my approach to borders, territories, and mobilities in isolation, treating them as separate phenomena, I want to bring attention to how I see these concepts as interrelated, co-produced, and co-constitutive of the conditions shaping the international realm and challenging asylum-seeking behaviors. I'll start by briefly noting that my understanding of borders is one of understanding practices of bordering, of differentiating, creating, and enabling particular relations between that which is asserted as belonging here or there. The idea of the disaggregated border speaks to the composition and function of the borders in ways that are inclusive of multiple overlapping, interlocking practices, discourses, and institutions, differentiating between territories, resources, legal jurisdictions, markets, communities, peoples, and identities. Of these bordering practices, my research focuses primarily on the tensions that arise between supposedly territorially bound judicial borders and increasingly deterritorialized functional borders that regulate human mobility. The move to disaggregate the concept of the border into its multiple and overlapping parts allows the researcher to more clearly identify and address tensions, contradictions, and problems arising from a complex system or field borders. The concept of the disaggregated border emerges from critical reflections on the status of borders in a post-Cold War era of global connections, flows, mobilities, and challenges that increasingly defy territorial containment. Within this critical tradition, scholars have generally challenged the idea that globalization means that borders are going away. In addition to pointing to statistics that demonstrate that border walls and fences have been on the rise for the past 3 decades, critics of a declining borders thesis often point to how new global challenges and opportunities for international cooperation have shifted how and where states exercise power, therein establishing new international geometries and bounded constellations of power. For example, in speaking to the relationship between borders and territories, Hartmut Baer writes a paradox of globalization, where globalization challenges or global challenges framed through the language of security no longer operate through the territorial inside-outside logics of the state. In response to these transnational challenges and to reassert their power in global politics, states, Baer had argued in 2008, must overcome their traditional principles of territorial politics while transforming territorial traditions of statehood and sovereignty. While Baer uses the language of states overcoming territorial restraints on power, I think the issue here might be better framed as states rearticulating their territoriality through policies and practices which both transgress and reinscribe the boundaries of interiority and exteriority. My thinking on borders and boundaries also emerges from Thomas Niles' work on migration and borders, where he blends a top-down theoretical and bottom-up experiential approach to understanding the functioning of borders as junctions and channels. Niles' approach illustrates in very material terms how borders are constituted through physical enforcements, legal systems, and experiences of the territorial, political, judicial, and economic bordering regimes. In many ways, Niles' work can be read as a response to Etienne Balibar's critique of the move to interpret borders as situated everywhere, and thus also nowhere. Building on this critical research framework, both Niall and Martina Tassoli present critical understandings of the conditions under which a person in motion, exercising mobility, becomes a migrant practicing migration, where a regime of social motion and biopolitical borders create and describe new political subjectivities and rights, which are confined and enabled within particular boundaries. Nick Vaughan Williams expands on these notions by arguing that borders are biopolitical phenomena, that they can be theorized and understood as, quote, portable machines of sovereign power that are inseparable from the bodies they performatively produce and sort into different categories. Crawley and Skleparis in 2018 further interrogate the relationship between borders and mobilities as defined by a process in politics of bounding, where migrant categories are deconstructed and migrant experiences of precarity and risk are demonstrated to be products of bordering. Completing the sort of conceptual triad you can see on the slide, I'll turn briefly to exploring theories of the relationship between mobility and territory. In my own work, I'm being careful to distinguish between mobility and migration, where mobility might refer to human motion, and where migration can describe motions that are captured within and governed by spatial models of political organization. Mobility has been theorized as a kind of counterpower, challenging the assumptions and privileging of stasis that is used by states. In this light, and is also argued by Niall, migration can be theorized as a product and discourse of states seeking to order, regulate, and contain mobility within limited boundaries between two fixed points. Where migration regimes establish the conditions of acceptable mobility and regularity, mobilities which transgress these boundaries and deviate from two fixed points come to be perceived and policed as irregularities. Crowley and Skleparis again speak to the relationship between territory and mobility in their analysis of how refugees and asylum seekers come to be defined in international law as protected irregularities in an international system. Both of the legal categorizations and rights of refugees and asylum seekers are dependent on the individual's relationships to and within the sending and receiving territories. Just as a reminder, the legal definition of a refugee relies on a person having crossed an international border and having left their country under threat of persecution, conflict, or violence. The act of crossing an international border distinguishes between a refugee with rights under the Convention and an internally displaced person with more ambiguous and less enforceable claims to rights and protections. The asylum seeker typically occupies the space between sending and receiving territories, where they are en route to claim protection. Occupying the ambiguous space that is between territorial jurisdictions and firmly within the expanding fields of the border, they are neither refugee nor internally displaced. The asylum seekers' border crossing mobilities are typically captured and policed within frameworks of irregularity. Although these irregular mobilities are protected under the Convention, the legal procedures and mechanisms which work to authorize and regularize these irregularities are territorially bound, dependent on the condition of having crossed the territorial boundary that is made increasingly inaccessible. So to sum up, my approach to understanding contemporary border enforcement and migration governance as it relates to and impacts the practice of seeking asylum rests on understanding how borders, territories, and mobilities interact with each other. On this next slide, you'll see a very rough and general visualization of my understanding of how mobilities can interact with borders. Border practices and experiences on the ground are much more complex than this diagram shows, but it illustrates a few important ideas. First, this model of the border is quite thick, and perhaps it's best described as visualizing a border field or border zone. Then its thickness comes from its inclusions of the borders that are turned inwards and outwards, where border controls and bordering strategies are delinked from the territorial limits and frontiers of states. The lines are intentionally wavy and curved to capture the sense that bordering practices can be dynamic, flexible, manipulated, and selectively applied. With arrows forming a circle, I've tried to represent movement within the limits of the state, referencing the idea that borders also function to condition life and activity within the state. One of the challenges I've encountered in my research relates to language and analytical focus. When I first proposed this research, I intended to focus solely on the external dimensions of borders and bordering. At the stage now where I'm needing to make some big decisions, I'm reconsidering this initial proposal. I'm not so convinced that I can unpack how shifting bordering practices are rearticulating relations with territory by only looking at one side of what could arguably be a two-sided or four-sided border. Nevertheless, I still see my research drawing heavily from the insights and theorizations which emerge from literature on externalization. From the late 90s onwards, many scholars have asked and have sought to understand why and how policy actors have introduced remote migration management strategies under the names of offshoring, extraterritoriality, outsourcing, and buffering. Characteristically, these writings on externalization typically connect to studies of the militarization of border enforcement and the securitization of migration. These writings have offered strong theorizations and detailed descriptions of the policies and mechanisms implemented by states to manage human mobilities and regionalize migration control strategies. This is exemplified by Alison Muntz's Long Tunnel thesis, which explored the creation of geographies of exclusion through an analysis of Canada's maritime arrival processing system and third country agreements. Similarly influential was Christina Boswell's 2003 article that attributed the rise of externalized and preventative policy approaches to migration to, and quote, institutional structures such as the Schengen area and electoral pressures, such as the populist scapegoating of immigrants in the context of the EU. However, technological advancements, changing policy preferences that render externalization the norm rather than exception, and new framings of various migration crises that take into account global relations of capitalism and colonialism have exposed the limits of some of this earlier work. Some scholars, like Emily Gilbert, have analyzed how border elasticity, being static in some cases while dynamic in others, enables geographies of enforcement, while others have focused on the creation of corridors and channels cutting through and reestablishing lines of movement. Elsewhere, contemporary research agendas propose critically mapping the deterritoriality of borders, examining the convergences and conflicts between the functions of physical barriers, bureaucratic paper walls, and virtual walls created by data information systems. Further, reflections on so-called migration crises have emphasized the need to critically evaluate what borders do, what they produce, what sorts of mobilities they channel and regulate, and which sorts of enforcement strategies they enable and constrain. For the most part, recent studies on the humanitarian dimensions of externalization of borders have focused on unpacking the policies and circumstances particular to one or a few countries or regions, permitting a detailed case or comparative analysis. For example, Jazz Dawson writes of the offshoring and non-entree practices enacted in the Australian case, and the consequences of such restrictions on LGBTQ asylum seekers arriving irregularly from Indonesia. As well, Paulo Cotita examines the on-the-ground consequences of European strategies to immobilize and prevent the departures of would-be border crossers passing through Egypt and Tunisia. In both studies, authors conclude with normative assessments of border externalization, citing patterns of the mistreatment of asylum seekers, the denial of protection, and the risk of refoulement in contravention of the spirit of the 1951 Convention, yet legally ambiguous. My own research will take a similar normative stance in assessing safe third country agreements, but I want to strengthen the position against such restrictive measures by situating the terms of compliance with the 1951 Convention within its own historical context and comparing those historical border institutions and practices to those of today. In 2001, Gaius Goodwin Gill, a legal scholar, published a lengthy analysis of the 31st article of the 1951 Convention, situating the language of the text in the context of particular debates and concerns of the committee members at the 51 Geneva Convention, or Geneva Conference. The 31st article is especially significant for understanding when signatories to the convention may or may not apply penalties to those who move and cross boundaries without authorization. Quote, the contracting states shall not impose penalties on account of their illegal entry or presence on refugees who, coming directly from a territory where their life or freedom was threatened in the sense of Article 1, enter or are present in the territory without authorization, provided they present themselves without delay to the authorities and show good cause for their illegal entry or presence. Illustrating the strength of interpreting legal decisions and norms through historical contextualization, Goodwin Gill's analysis of the language of coming directly in the context of one French delegate's political concerns over refugees safely in Belgium Opting to apply for asylum in France removes ambiguity from the term that might otherwise be exploited by states that do not directly neighbor refugee-sending countries and do not neighbor countries that can be said to be safe. Goodwin Gill's assessment of noncompliance with the 31st article ends with general conclusions condemning detention for reasons other than what is, quote, prescribed by law and necessary for processing the identities of asylum seekers and for the protection of public order, health, and morals. In my research and adding to Goodwin Gill, I want to expand on this work to assess the challenging legality of restrictions on movements of refugees and asylum seekers who are not subject to detention, but rather prevented from leaving states and territories where they face risk of persecution, arbitrary detention, unfair hearings, or refoulement. In 2005, Ralph Wild similarly asked to what extent states are accountable for the harms and rights violations that occur through their extraterritorial activities, but found such a question challenged by what he identified as, quote, a legal black hole, where few or even no legal standards exist by which to judge. Restrictions on rights in extraterritorial contexts. My research considers the difficulties of assessing the externalization and disaggregation of borders in light of these loopholes, if not black holes, in the 51 Convention that have emerged as a consequence of changing border practices and territorialities. As we wind down the presentation, I wanted to acknowledge that I don't really have answers to the questions I posed at the beginning. I'm in the early stages of writing and coming up with a framework for analyzing borders and understanding how shifting border practices complicate the process of seeking asylum. My hope for today was to use the platform the center has given me to reflect on and receive feedback on some of the conceptual challenges, debates, and stakes my research project engages with. So I want to thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I'm eager to hear your feedback and respond to questions.
Sorry, thank you, Juliana. Yes, my sense is that there will be some questions and comments and conversations emerging from all of this here at the Center for Global Studies. Would people like to, could I ask people if you're comfortable to turn on your video, but please keep your microphone off until you'd like to make a comment or enter into a conversation or pose a question? That's great, thanks for it. Dagmar, welcome. Thank you.
It's so amazing to hear Juliana talk this much, so congratulations for getting through the presentation. I'm sure this was really challenging for you. I also wanted to congratulate you because I wish some of our PhD students would have read as much as you have already read by this point in the game. So congratulations. I was really fascinated by all the authors you mentioned, by how much of a deep dive you've done into the border studies literature and related literatures. So now, of course, the first point is you're an MA student, and I hope you're going to be doing a PhD. I think you're going to be hotly contested for, so think about when you might want to take this word next, because you've raised so many amazing questions that you cannot possibly all answer by the time you're done. So this is where I'm tiptoeing up to my questions for you. I was trying to decide which of all of these really interesting things will be at the heart of your discussion, because there were so many interesting candidates. And then towards the end, you talked a little bit more about some of the legal scholars. And that was also another question I had. And then I wanted to just, I guess, challenge you, because you talked a lot about Canada and the EU. And some of these practices, the borders it's not the same in the global south, right? So I guess I wonder whether, if this was a dissertation, I would say, I'm sure you're going to be discussing this somewhere, but some of these border practices, externalization, blah, 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 fluidity things, they're just not the same in a refugee camp or in Indonesia or somewhere else. And I'm just bringing this up because it's an interesting contrast to some of the literature that you've gone through, because I think it's so heavily global north focused that I don't want to encourage you to do more reading, but it's interesting in terms of arriving at your own conclusions to think about the contrast. Then in terms of you're very careful with all the disclaimers attached with recommendations, you've talked a little bit about amending the convention in terms of compliance, and then Article 31 in particular. That's all interesting, but is that really what you want to recommend? Because you started off by saying, is there an international system of borders? I don't really think there is. I think there is we want to pretend that there is a global international refugee regime, and yeah, we've got all these norms and supposedly everybody should be complying to them. But this is where we're in this loop of some of these externalization practices were invented because states don't want to comply for the obvious reason of othering. So with apologies to Natalie, legal scholars, like this is why some of these cases are in the courts. So think about what you want to recommend, but I guess I'd like to hear more about what of these many questions would be your central one? How do you think some of the differences in the global south might make a difference to your analysis? And I could say lots more, but I'll shut up. But congratulations again. It was really exciting to hear so much about what you've been thinking about.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. I really appreciate your questions. I think they point to many of the limits of my research and what an MA thesis can achieve. In terms of what I'm hoping my central question to be, I do really enjoy the theoretical debates and arguments within the field. And I'm particularly interested in comparing historical institutions and practices of bordering with contemporary ones, just to point to gaps and changes in how we understand mobility and relationships with territory. I thank you again for pointing out that this is taking a very strong global north focus. It's one critical of practices within the global north, but yeah, I would really enjoy to bring in more focus to global south, because I'm not sure, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that one, so thank you. And
yeah, and it's not something I'm saying you have to do, right? It's just there's an interesting contrast in maybe just doing some reading and thinking about the implications for what you are actually trying to do. You don't have to read more, so that's just it's not something you need to do, but it has implications perhaps for your thinking. And you know that already, so.
Yeah, I think that one, I think, challenges me to think more critically about what is imagined to be the international system. I think it's generally quite exclusionary of global south experiences and practices. So I think amending the language there and acknowledging what international I'm speaking of in this thesis would be a way to approach it. And then in terms of the legal terms of the convention and recommendations, I'm not sure if this is going to become a major part of my research. When I think about addressing gaps and protections, my mind goes to thinking about legal conventions and terms. But yeah, I'm not so sure there, but thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Dagmar. Natalie.
Hi, Juliana. Sorry, I've got my cameras mixed up here. Juliana, I so enjoyed that talk. Thank you very much. It was a very thoughtfully organized and sophisticated introduction to some of the most current and provocative research being done in the field. So you did a really masterful job of sharing that with us, and I learned a lot from it. So thanks for that. I think I have 4 different things that I wanted to ask you, but I'll limit myself and I'll just perhaps, as helpfully as I can, follow up on Dagmar's comment. She said you don't have to do any more reading. She was just making suggestions. If you decide to do more reading, I have a suggestion. It happens that it's sitting on my desk. So this book, which is a classic by James C. Scott, is called The Art of Not Being Governed. And it's about, I don't know if you've ever run across it, but because I'm also a political scientist, it's a a study of resistance in Southeast Asia by indigenous populations to the consolidation of state forms. And there's a really nice resonance there with, it's got a global South focus, but there's also a nice resonance with this idea of resistance expressed through mobility. And it might be just, there may be some very interesting resonances for you if you had a look at this or parts of it. The idea of mobility as counterpower and transgressing fixed borders, and not just fixed borders, but established practices of state building and state expression. So I think that you might find it really interesting, and it's a place to look. I wanted to invite you to talk about another aspect of Thomas Niles' work, another strand that you referred to in the actual question that I have, and that's the question about biopolitical borders. And I really just wondered if you'd like to say more about the quote that you gave us. I think you said that migrants are portable machines of sovereign power. I'm not sure if I got that right. And there's obviously a strong Foucaultian influence there, but what aspect of Niles's characterization that you're planning to really emphasize in your own work is something I'd really find interesting. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for that recommendation. I'm going to be looking for that in the library today. So the quote about the borders and migration being a portable machine of sovereign power, I think comes from Nick Vaughan Williams, but I do take a lot of inspiration from Thomas Niles' work on kinopolitics, or the politics of motion and mobility. I find it interesting how he approaches theory from the position and assumption that mobility is first, and that stasis is something that is applied by states to control motions and mobilities. I really appreciate how his work on borders positions borders as junctions or channels that change mobility and channel mobility in ways that are conducive to some of to state governance. I'm not sure if that's really answering your question, but I think putting mobility first and seeing stasis as the state's attempt to control and regulate how people move is an interesting way to do theory that kind of challenges the status and static assumptions of political life.
Thanks, Juliana. No, that's great.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, Michael Dagmar, for placing links in the chats to the literature. So to encourage everybody to continue to do that. It's a tremendous resource. Any other questions? Oh, thank you, Phil.
Hi, and thanks, Juliana, for a really fascinating talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I guess I have a question that's more like I'd like to just hear your thoughts on this, because I think what you've put forward that I find super compelling is to think about bordering as a global technology of interlinked regimes of rule, basically. And if I'm understanding the stakes of the previous conversation around global North, global South, I prefer imperial core versus third world as a way of thinking about this personally. But if I understand the stakes that are there in what you're saying, it sort of lines up with what I've read recently from Harsha Walia's work, where what she's tracking is the exportation of bordering regimes from the North to the South, where Northern governments are quite literally hiring and financing very hardened forms of bordering in the South so that they're not doing that work on their own borders. And I'm wondering if that's basically what you're trying to outline here, maybe in a more theoretical language, in terms of thinking about this global regime of bordering, that we have to think on the scale of the global totality rather than on the sort of surface level of what we presume to be borders. And maybe to put it in the language of James C. Scott, we have to see beyond seeing like a state. We have to be able to see like a global system, actually.
Thank you. So just building off of that, I also am familiar with Walia's work, and part of the idea of externalization of borders, I think, is reflected in offshore detention facilities, as well as international agreements where the work of bordering is kind of imported into other regions around the globe. And I think it's a huge challenge for asylum seeking and refugees, in the sense that it's becoming harder to cross borders and access regimes of protection, because this work is being done elsewhere, much further away from the borders of Europe than it could be in the past. And in the case of Canada, you could say that our external borders are as far south as Mexico or Guatemala, with safe third country agreements in effect. So I can appreciate your comments, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Juliana. Amy.
Thanks so much, Juliana, for that really careful and thoughtful and reflective presentation, and the courage to present, at this stage of your research. It's really brave and commendable, and to get a sense of all the sort of theoretical and methodological issues you're grappling with. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you're thinking in terms of sort of navigating the limitations of doing this work in an MA thesis. And you mentioned sort of discourse analysis and, potentially working with, a dyad of countries, or focusing more on sort of the international. But yeah, I'd love to hear some more thoughts about how you're sort of thinking through how to apply some of these things in perhaps a case context. And then also, if you're thinking about grad school PhD down the line, I have some wonderful friends at University of Toronto in mobility and migration studies. If you're interested in connecting with them, happy to do so.
Thank you. So when I proposed my thesis, it was much more extensive. I wanted to do a bunch of different case studies, but realized it wasn't possible to do that. I had also wanted to bring in a lot of theorizing with respect to experiences of borders on the ground, but I didn't like the idea of piecing apart stories and experiences in a way to suit my research needs. So at this point, I'm thinking about focusing more on the theoretical dimensions of the project, and perhaps looking at one or two case studies, the first being conditions at the drafting of the 1951 convention, and the second being perhaps a case study of Canadian borders, because they are closer to home, and I feel like I have a stake and responsibility to engage with those conditions. So I'd like to retain like a strong theoretical focus, and then I guess ground that theory in those two case studies, which do address kind of the spatial and temporal dimensions of the refugee regime.
Juliana, can I sort of follow up on that in terms of where case studies fit into your thinking around all this? Do you find yourself drawn back to that Greek-Turkish border? I mean, given all the work you did a few years ago, I mean, in a different time period, but I mean, it's given its prominence over the last few years, does that resonate in your own attempts to think about this as a particularly important case study, or have you kind of moved on?
I think it's important that it illustrates a lot of what's at stake in the kinds of theoretical questions I engage with. I'm not sure that I would use it as a case study, but it's something that I might draw attention to as an instance of what's going on and the real world challenges that this kind of theoretical or abstract work touches on and can impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and where that border is in terms of all that effort by Europe to pay the leader of Turkey to do that management for them. Okay, Natalie. Oh, sorry, Natalie, is that, you haven't just left the hand up from before, okay.
No, I'm just struggling to try to formulate the thing I want to ask. So work that I did about 25 years ago focused on the kind of insidious emergence of a security discourse around the concept of human security and the way in which health issues and other issues that had no connection with the concept of security historically were starting to be discussed in international policymaking circles in terms of the concept of security. And the process was called the securitization of, health and all of these other things. So I'm really interested in what you had to say about the way in which security discourse has
Have we lost Natalie? Interesting. How ... Why don't we, JiaBin, before I turn back to you, but I'll bring Natalie back in as soon as Zoom allows her to. But John Swanson, you had a question. Would you like to ask it, or I could repeat it from the chat? Julianne, John asks, just curious about territoriality. Just curious about extraterritoriality in terms of Australia's offshore detention as a legacy of colonialism.
Thanks, John. So I haven't been looking too closely at the Australian case in the past few months, but one thing I might mention was connected to colonialism in the case of immigration and migration to Australia is the policy enacted in the 20th century. I think it was called the White Australia Policy, and I need to double check on this one before I really engage with your question. But I would mention that there is a history and continuity of racialized bordering practices that are both externally oriented and then also turned inwards as well.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, John. Denmark.
You want to give Natalie another minute? I mean, I can just.
Could you mind filling that minute in the meantime?
Juliana, I think I just wanted to encourage you. You have a bunch of questions in your slides that you've kind of answered. So the question is, how much time do you then want to spend in terms of cutting down and focusing? You can spend only 2 pages talking about something rather than 10. So for example, how do international agreements interact with territorially bound procedures for asylum? The answer that you're offering is externalization, right? So that's already something that's one of the ways. The other way is that in the global north, it's territorially bound. In the global south, you might be stuck in the refugee camp in Kakuma, or you might be in Turkey, which is not a member of the convention. So you've answered that one. But the 2 examples that you're interested in, how do they, and I'm saying the 2 examples because you said conditions of drafting of the convention, and then a Canadian case. So how do they then interplay with that central question that you're trying to answer? You might have already seen that Rebecca Hamlin, my colleague from the US, has a book out that is talking about the different categories. And there's also a German colleague, and I can send you the link if you haven't seen this already, who just finished an article that's talking about the 1951 convention. And that's where a bunch of the colonialism, racial capital literature also comes in. But the question then is, how does all that then feed into, what does it illuminate in the central thing that you're trying to ask about? It talks about power and borders, but how do the examples feed into your central question? Because that might shift all the fascinating literature around, right? So that's the important thing. What can you take off the table or maybe just discuss in a paragraph, and how do the examples highlight the thing that you're most interested in? And that's what you're in control of, because I love history, and you could also make a connection between Canada not being at the table, well, being at the table in 1951, but then not wanting to sign on to the convention until the 1960s because Canada did not want to give rights to people. And there's lots of literature on this, but I don't know if that fits in with your interest in bordering and territoriality so much. So again, think about the example and how it illuminates this one central thing you're interested in. She's not back yet, but I'll shut up anyway.
Right, thank you. I guess I was really drawn to seeing 1951 as a kind of case study for comparison with today and with Canadian borders, because I think it highlights some of the legal foundations and thinking of borders, and it allows me to kind of see borders in a genealogical or historical way to understand shifts in how borders are practiced, theorized, and understood by policymakers. I'm not feeling particularly attached to one case study over another, but like I said, I feel like I have a stake in how Canadian borders function, and yeah.
Thank you both. So Natalie has,
She may have just, I don't think she's here. I think she's at home. So she might have
Okay.
Wi-Fi issues.
yeah, it could be that Natalie has, she hasn't engaged in the chat either, so.
She doesn't email me either.
Yeah, it's interesting how we're drawn to case studies, aren't we? I mean, there's a historian in me too, Dad, to think the importance of thinking about how that plays out, or the helpfulness in understanding how that plays out. Okay, if there aren't any more questions on Zoom, Juliana, if you're at all comfortable joining us here, perhaps we could continue the conversation both here. Oh, Natalie's come back. So I'll allow her to finish. Actually, what I'll do is pause here, give her a bit of time to connect. And then, welcome back, Natalie.
Hi.
Natalie, maybe I could ask you to start from the beginning again.
Sorry about that, everybody. There's a problem with our power cord, apparently. You should jiggle it just right, it'll work. I was trying to ask a question about how you're planning to use the work that you cited on the dialectic between transcendence of the internal external logic of sovereignty, the transcendence and the reaffirmation that the security discourse has made possible. It's obviously it's something that runs through your thinking in a really strong way, but I'm really interested in whether that very big idea is something that you've got a kind of clear through line on how you're going to use that in your work. It's a really challenging kind of pervasive idea, but it's also a little bit slippery. It's kind of the dialectic aspect of it is, I think, the thing that makes it interesting, but it's also hard to use.
Thank you. I think that's something, the question of the internal, external logics of sovereignty is something that I'll need to be working through in my paper. I do think this is an issue that runs through the issues of borders, mobilities, and territories. But when we see transgressions of borders or that internal, external logic, I think we're not really seeing the border losing that internal external logic, but re-articulating it in new ways, in new spaces. And it's both a challenge, but I think it opens up new possibilities for thinking about migration governance and bordering strategies to humanitarian ends. So I want to thank you for raising that point again. I think it's a really important one.
Juliana, I might just follow up quickly, if that's okay with Martin, and say that your answer reminds me of what you said earlier about alluding to international laws, the fact that the dominant system of international law is really the exported public law of Europe, and that there are other international, or whatever we want to call them, transboundary systems for resolving conflict that are highly sophisticated and that are associated with different, generally imperial, but not always, regimes in different parts of the globe. And that's something, there's a lot of really interesting work being done under the auspices of the TWAIL School, the Third World Approaches to International Law School, but also Anne Orford, who's at Melbourne University's Law School. She has a cluster of people that have been working with her. They're working on different international laws. And you might find some of that work really evocative for some of the distinctions you're trying to draw and some of the distinctions you're trying to contest. So that might be an interesting place to look.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you to all of you for participating. Thank you for all of the contributions to the chat. We hopefully will have a way of recording the chat or keeping a record of these. We'll keep it open for a little while too, so that you can all take a look at it. Juliana, a special thanks to you for taking us through in such remarkable fashion, such a complex literature and all those with tremendous insights.